The day my son called my bingo nights pathetic was the same day I deposited a check for $47,000. I was standing in the marble lobby of First National Bank, holding my phone to my ear while Marcus ranted about my Tuesday and Thursday evenings at the Riverside Community Center. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that those supposedly pathetic nights had earned me more money in the past 2 years than he made at his fancy consulting firm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Chen, and at 68, I've learned that family can surprise you in the most disappointing ways. The conversation with Marcus had started innocently enough. He'd called to tell me about his daughter Sophia's acceptance to Northwestern University, and naturally, the topic of tuition came up. $28,000 a year, he'd said, his voice heavy with concern. That's when I made the mistake of mentioning that I might be able to help. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Marcus laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Mom, that's sweet, but where would you get that kind of money? You spend your evenings playing bingo with a bunch of other retirees. It's honestly kind of pathetic." Pathetic. The word stung more than I expected. I stood there in the bank lobby, watching the teller count out crisp hundreds from my latest jackpot win, and felt something shift inside me. For 2 years, I'd been quietly building a fortune through strategic gambling, tournament play, and careful investment of my winnings. I'd kept it secret partly out of modesty, partly because I enjoyed having something that was entirely mine. But hearing my own son dismiss my life as pathetic made me realize how little my family actually knew about who I'd become since their father died. After Harold passed 5 years ago, everyone expected me to fade into the background of their lives. The grieving widow who needed checking on, who required gentle management and careful supervision. Marcus and his wife Diane took over our family finances during those first difficult months, and somehow never gave them back. My daughter-in-law had strong opinions about how I should spend my days, none of which involved activities she deemed appropriate for someone of my age and station. The bingo had started as a distraction. My neighbor Betty invited me one Tuesday evening, claiming I needed to get out of the house. The Riverside Community Center was a 20-minute drive from my subdivision, filled with folding tables and the chatter of mostly older adults clutching their Lucky Charms and daubers. I expected to play a few games, maybe win a small cash prize, and return home with a mild sense of accomplishment. What I didn't expect was to discover that I had a natural gift for pattern recognition and an almost supernatural ability to track multiple cards simultaneously. While other players struggled with 3 or 4 cards, I could easily manage 12. My mathematical background from my years as a high school algebra teacher served me well in calculating odds and managing my bankroll. Within 3 months, I was winning more nights than I lost. The first big win came on a humid Thursday in July. The jackpot had rolled over for 6 weeks, growing to $12,000. I remember the moment clearly because it was the first time I'd won more money than Harold had made in a month during his working years. The caller announced B7, and I looked down at my cards, heart racing as I realized I had a coverall on card number 9. My hands shook as I called out bingo, and the room erupted in applause. That night, driving home with a cashier's check in my purse, I made a decision. I wouldn't tell Marcus and Diane about the win. Something about their recent behavior, their subtle but persistent attempts to manage my social life and spending habits, made me want to keep this victory private. I deposited the money into a separate account I opened the next morning. The wins continued. Some weeks I'd break even, others I'd come home with hundreds or even thousands of dollars. I started researching the mathematics of bingo, studying probability tables, and developing systems for card selection. I learned about progressive jackpots, tournament circuits, and the underground world of high-stakes bingo that existed parallel to the church basement games most people imagined. 6 months after that first big win, I drove 3 hours to a regional tournament in Springfield. The buy-in was $500, more than I'd ever risked on a single session. The competition was fierce, filled with semi-professional players who traveled from state to state chasing major jackpots. I finished third that weekend, taking home $8,000 and an invitation to join an exclusive circuit of tournament players. That's when my hobby became something else entirely. I started traveling regularly, sometimes driving as far as Chicago or St. Louis for major tournaments. My wins grew larger and more frequent. I reinvested a portion of my winnings, building a bankroll that allowed me to play at higher stakes. The rest I invested conservatively in index funds and municipal bonds, advice I'd gotten from a financial advisor I'd quietly hired. The secret became easier to maintain as time passed. Marcus and Diane were absorbed in their own lives, their successful careers and busy social calendar. They checked on me dutifully, usually with phone calls that followed the same pattern. How was I feeling? Was I eating properly? Had I considered joining the senior center for activities more appropriate than those Tuesday night bingo games? If they'd paid closer attention, they might have noticed that my modest ranch house had undergone subtle but expensive improvements. The old furnace had been replaced with a high-efficiency system. The roof had been redone with premium materials. The kitchen appliances were top-of-the-line models, though I'd chosen finishes that looked appropriately modest. I'd even had a small addition built onto the back of the house, a sunroom where I could sit in the mornings with my coffee and plan my tournament schedule. But they didn't notice, just as they didn't notice that I'd quietly paid off my mortgage 2 years early, or that I'd purchased a newer car, a reliable sedan that could handle long drives to tournaments without drawing attention to itself. Their mental image of me remained frozen in time, the helpless widow who needed their guidance and protection. My granddaughter Sophia was different. At 18, she possessed the curiosity and observation skills that her parents seemed to have lost. During our monthly lunch dates, she would ask genuine questions about my life, not the superficial inquiries about my health that characterized most family conversations. She was the one who noticed when I mentioned traveling to different cities, though I was careful to frame these trips as visits to old friends, rather than gambling expeditions. "Grandma," she'd said during our last lunch together, "you seem really happy lately. Like genuinely happy in a way you weren't right after Grandpa died." She was right. The bingo, the travel, the accumulating wins had given me a sense of purpose and excitement I hadn't felt in years. Every tournament was a challenge, every jackpot a validation of skills I'd discovered in myself long after most people assumed my learning days were over. I'd found a community of players who valued strategic thinking and mathematical precision, who didn't see my age as a limitation but as an advantage born of patience and experience. The circuit had its own culture and hierarchy. There were players who'd been competing for decades, legends who could track 15 cards simultaneously while carrying on complex conversations. There were younger players, usually women in their 40s and 50s, who approached the game with the same intensity they'd once brought to raising children or building careers. And there were newcomers like me, discovering late in life that they possessed talents they'd never suspected. My closest friend in this world was a 72-year-old retired engineer named Frank Morrison, who'd been playing tournaments for 15 years. Frank had calculated that he'd won over $200,000 during his career, money he used to fund an extensive travel schedule with his wife Meredith. They spent summers following the tournament circuit across the Midwest, winters in Florida playing at the major resorts, and spring and fall at home in Kansas City, where Frank taught classes on advanced bingo strategy. The secret, Frank had told me during my second tournament, is that most people think bingo is pure luck. They don't understand that skill and strategy can shift the odds significantly in your favor. They play for fun, which is fine, but it means there'll never be serious competition. He was right. At the recreational level, bingo was indeed mostly luck. But at the tournament level, success required discipline, mathematical understanding, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. It required the same skills that had made me an effective teacher, and herald and successful accountant. Skills that Marcus and Diane apparently couldn't imagine their aging mother possessing. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus worked 60-hour weeks at a consulting firm, constantly stressed about billable hours and client relationships, earning what he considered an impressive salary. Meanwhile, I was making more money in a good month than he made in a quarter, and I was having fun doing it. The tournaments were social events as much as competitions, filled with people who shared my love of strategy and probability. I'd made friends across 3 states, people who knew me as Dorothy the tournament player, rather than Dorothy the widow who needed careful supervision. My success hadn't gone unnoticed in the circuit. Last spring, I'd been invited to write a strategy column for Bingo Monthly, a trade publication I'd never heard of before I started playing seriously. The monthly fee was modest, but it came with the validation of being recognized as an expert in something I'd discovered so late in life. I'd also been approached about teaching strategy seminars, though I'd declined for fear of drawing too much attention to my activities. The wins were getting larger as my reputation grew. Tournament organizers now knew my name, and other players had begun studying my techniques. I'd developed a signature style that combined aggressive card play with conservative bankroll management, allowing me to compete at the highest levels while minimizing risk. My average monthly winnings had grown to nearly $8,000, though I was careful to declare everything properly on my taxes, working with an accountant who specialized in gambling income. Which brought me back to that phone call with Marcus, standing in the bank lobby with a $47,000 check in my hand. It was my largest single win, the result of a weekend tournament in Indianapolis, where I'd placed first in the championship division. The prize had been $35,000, but I'd also won smaller tournaments throughout the weekend, pushing my total winnings to just over $47,000. As I watched the teller process my deposit, I thought about Marcus's casual dismissal of my pathetic bingo nights. I thought about the tuition bill that was causing him so much stress, an amount I could cover without denting my tournament bankroll. I thought about Diane's recent comments about how I needed to face reality about my finances and consider moving to a senior living community where my expenses would be more manageable. They had no idea that I was probably the wealthiest member of our family. Between my tournament winnings, investment growth, and Harold's life insurance and pension, my net worth had grown substantially since his death. The irony was that their concern for my financial well-being was exactly backwards. If anyone needed financial help, it was them, with their oversized mortgage, luxury car payments, and private school tuition bills. But they couldn't see it that way, because they couldn't see me as anything other than the fragile widow who needed their protection. In their minds, I was still the woman who'd collapsed sobbing at Harold's funeral, who'd needed help managing basic household tasks during those first difficult months of grief. They'd never updated their mental image to include the woman who could calculate complex probability matrices in her head, while managing 12 bingo cards simultaneously. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first months after Harold's death had indeed been devastating. I'd never lived alone, never managed finances independently, never made major decisions without consulting him first. The grief was overwhelming, complicated by practical challenges that seemed insurmountable. Marcus and Diane had stepped in during those early weeks, handling funeral arrangements, managing paperwork, and generally taking control of my life in ways that had felt necessary at the time. But grief, I'd learned, wasn't a permanent condition. Slowly, tentatively, I'd begun rebuilding my sense of self. The bingo had been part of that process, but so had other changes. I'd started reading again, devouring books on mathematics and probability theory that connected to my newfound interest. I'd taken up gardening, transforming Harold's workshop space into a greenhouse where I grew orchids and exotic vegetables. I'd even learned to use technology more effectively, joining online forums where tournament players shared strategies and upcoming event information. Each small victory had built my confidence, preparing me for larger challenges. Learning to manage 12 bingo cards had taught me that my mind was sharper than I'd given it credit for. Winning my first tournament had shown me that I could compete successfully against much younger players. Building my investment portfolio had proved that I could make sound financial decisions independently. But my family hadn't witnessed any of these transformations. They saw me at Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, where I played the role they expected, the grateful mother and grandmother who appreciated their concern and guidance. I listened to their advice about my social activities, nodded when they suggested I consider moving to a more manageable living situation, and never contradicted their assumptions about my financial limitations. Now walking out of the bank with my deposit receipt, I wondered how much longer I could maintain this charade. The money was accumulating faster than I could spend it, even with my increased travel and higher living expenses. My accountant had suggested establishing a trust or foundation, finding structured ways to distribute my wealth that would provide tax advantages. But that would require conversations with my family about the true extent of my assets, conversations I wasn't sure I was ready to have. Part of me enjoyed the secret. There was satisfaction in knowing something they didn't, in having a life they couldn't imagine or control. But increasingly I felt the burden of deception. When Marcus worried about Sophia's tuition, I wanted to help. When Diane mentioned their financial stress, I wanted to reassure them. When Sophia talked about her dreams of studying abroad or attending graduate school, I wanted to promise that money would never be an obstacle. The tournament circuit had taught me about strategy and timing, about when to reveal your strength and when to keep your cards hidden. But this wasn't a game, and the stakes were relationships rather than prize money. I needed to find a way to bridge the gap between who I'd become and who my family thought I was, without destroying the trust and respect I'd worked so hard to rebuild. That evening, I sat in my sunroom, with a cup of tea and my tournament calendar, planning my next few months of travel. There was a major tournament in Milwaukee the following weekend, with a guaranteed jackpot of $25,000. After that, the regional championships in Des Moines, where I'd placed second the previous year. And in December, the winter circuit would begin in Florida, 3 months of warm weather and high-stakes competition that had become the highlight of my year. Looking at this schedule, mapping out strategies and calculating potential winnings, I realized that my family's dismissal of my activities had become more than an annoyance. It had become a barrier to honest communication, preventing me from sharing the achievements and challenges that had come to define my life. Marcus's word pathetic had crystallized something I'd been feeling for months without fully acknowledging. I was proud of what I'd accomplished. I was proud of the skills I'd developed, the community I'd joined, and the financial security I'd created for myself. I was proud of my independence and my ability to thrive in circumstances that could have easily defeated me, but pride shared only with strangers. At tournaments wasn't the same as pride acknowledged by the people who mattered most. The next morning, I called Sophia. Unlike her parents, she answered her phone instead of letting calls go to voicemail, and she always had time to talk. "Grandma, perfect timing. I was just thinking about you." "Were you really? What were you thinking?" "I was wondering if you'd want to come to my graduation party next month. I know it's not your usual kind of thing, but it would mean a lot to have you there."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Her usual kind of thing. Even Sophia, who was more perceptive than her parents, had only a limited understanding of who I'd become. The graduation party would be filled with 18-year-olds and their families, exactly the sort of social gathering I would have avoided when I was still the grieving widow who needed careful management. But I wasn't that person anymore, and it was time to stop pretending I was. "I'd love to come," I said. "And Sophia, I've been thinking about our conversation at lunch last month, about college expenses and your parents' stress about tuition. Oh, Grandma, you don't need to worry about that stuff. I know money's tight for everyone. Actually, sweetheart, I think it's time I told you something about your grandmother's financial situation. It might surprise you." There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean that your tuition bill isn't as impossible as your father thinks it is. And those bingo nights he finds so pathetic, they've been more profitable than you might imagine." Another pause, longer this time. "Grandma, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that we need to have a family conversation, a real one, where I stop pretending to be helpless and your parents stop treating me like I am. It's time they learned who I really am." "This is going to be interesting," Sophia said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Yes," I thought, hanging up the phone. It certainly was going to be interesting. The question was whether my family was ready for the truth about Dorothy Chen, tournament bingo champion and the secret millionaire they'd been patronizing for the past 2 years. Whether they were ready or not, I was finally ready to show them. The confrontation I'd been anticipating came sooner than expected. 3 days after my phone conversation with Sophia, Marcus and Diane arrived at my house unannounced on a Saturday morning. I was in my sunroom, reviewing tournament schedules and calculating travel expenses for the upcoming Milwaukee event, when I heard their car pull into my driveway. Through the window, I watched them approach my front door with the determined stride of people on a mission. Diane carried a manila folder, and Marcus had that tight expression he wore when he thought he was about to solve a problem. I took a moment to gather my tournament materials and slip them into a drawer before answering the door. "Mom," Marcus said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." Diane followed him, her eyes immediately scanning my living room with the critical gaze she'd developed since becoming my unofficial life manager. "Dorothy, we're concerned about you," she announced, settling herself on my sofa as if she owned it. I remained standing, something that seemed to unsettle them both. In the past, I would have immediately offered coffee and positioned myself as the hostess grateful for their visit. Today, I simply waited for them to explain their presence. "Sophia called us yesterday," Marcus began, his tone suggesting this was somehow problematic. "She mentioned you'd said some confusing things about money and college tuition. Did she?" I kept my voice neutral, curious to see how they'd interpreted my granddaughter's account of our conversation. Diane opened her folder and withdrew several sheets of paper. "We've been doing some research, Dorothy. We think you might be experiencing some confusion about your financial situation." The papers, I realized, were printouts from various websites about senior fraud and financial exploitation. Articles about elderly people losing their savings to scams, warnings about the dangers of gambling addiction, and statistics about cognitive decline in older adults. "You see," Diane continued, spreading the papers on my coffee table like evidence in a court case, "seniors are particularly vulnerable to certain types of fraud, especially gambling-related schemes that promise unrealistic returns." Marcus leaned forward, adopting the patronizing tone he'd perfected over the past few years. "Mom, we know you've been going to those bingo games. And that's fine as a social activity. But if someone has been telling you that you're winning large amounts of money, well, that's a red flag for a scam." I stared at them both, processing the incredible assumptions underlying their visit. They'd decided that my conversation with Sophia indicated mental confusion or victimization by fraudsters. The possibility that I might actually have been winning money at bingo hadn't even occurred to them. "Have you given anyone access to your bank accounts?" Diane asked, pulling out a notepad. "Any new friends who've been particularly interested in your finances? Has anyone asked you to wire money or buy gift cards?" Marcus added, "These scammers are very sophisticated, Mom. They build trust over time before they strike." I walked to my kitchen and put the kettle on, partly to give myself time to think, and partly to see how they'd react to my apparent dismissal of their concerns. Through the doorway, I could hear them whispering urgently to each other. "She's not taking this seriously," Diane hissed. "Maybe the cognitive decline is further along than we thought," Marcus replied. The kettle's whistle provided a convenient interruption. I returned to the living room with a single cup of tea, noting their expressions when I didn't offer to make them any. "Let me understand this correctly," I said, settling into Harold's old recliner. "You believe I'm being scammed by criminals who are pretending I'm winning money at bingo. Is that accurate?" "We're just concerned," Marcus said carefully. "You mentioned to Sophia that you could help with tuition expenses. That suggests someone has convinced you that you have access to funds that don't actually exist." Diane nodded vigorously. "We've seen this before, Dorothy. Seniors who become convinced they've won lotteries or contests they never entered. The scammers are very convincing, and you've determined this based on what evidence exactly?" They exchanged glances. "Well," Marcus said, "we know your financial situation. Dad left you comfortable but not wealthy. Your Social Security and his pension cover your basic needs. But there's no way you could afford Northwestern tuition without depleting your savings." "I see," I sipped my tea, watching them fidget with their papers. "And you've reached these conclusions about my finances based on what information?" "We helped you organize everything after Dad died," Diane reminded me. "We know what accounts you have, and approximately what they contain." This was interesting. They were so confident in their knowledge of my finances that they'd never considered the possibility of additional accounts or income sources. Their mental image of my life was frozen at the moment they'd last had access to my bank statements, more than 3 years ago. That's true, I acknowledged. You were very helpful during those first few months, but it's been quite some time since you've had actual knowledge of my financial situation. Marcus frowned. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, I stood and retrieved my purse from the kitchen counter. From my wallet I pulled out the deposit receipt from my most recent bank visit and handed it to Marcus. He stared at the paper for a long moment, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. This says you deposited $47,000 last Tuesday. That's correct. Diane leaned over to read the receipt. This has to be fake. Dorothy, scammers often provide official-looking documents to make their victims believe the money is real. I walked to my desk and opened the drawer where I kept my financial records. Over the past 2 years, I'd been meticulous about documentation, partly for tax purposes and partly because I'd suspected this conversation would eventually happen. I returned with a folder containing bank statements from my tournament account. These statements go back 18 months, I said, handing the folder to Marcus. You'll notice regular deposits from various sources, all properly documented and reported to the IRS. As they studied the statements, I watched their certainty begin to crumble. The deposits were consistent, frequent, and substantial. More importantly, they were accompanied by withdrawals for travel expenses, entry fees, and other costs that suggested legitimate business activity rather than fictional windfall. Where is this money coming from? Marcus asked quietly. Tournament winnings, primarily, some from smaller local games, but most from regional and national competitions. Bingo tournaments. Diane's voice cracked slightly. Those actually exist. They do indeed. There's an entire circuit of professional and semi-professional players who travel across the country competing for substantial prize pools. I've become quite successful at it. Marcus was scrolling through the statements with growing amazement. Mom, some of these deposits are for tens of thousands of dollars. My largest single win was $63,000 at the national championships in Las Vegas last fall, though I prefer the smaller regional tournaments where the competition is less intense. They sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing information that contradicted everything they thought they knew about my life. I found myself curious about their reactions, wondering if they would be proud of my achievements or resentful of my deception. Why didn't you tell us? Diane finally asked. It was a fair question, and one I'd been preparing to answer. Initially, because I wasn't sure the success would continue. It seemed premature to celebrate what might have been temporary luck. Later, because your assumptions about my capabilities made it clear you wouldn't believe me. What do you mean? Marcus asked. You've spent the past 3 years treating me like a confused elderly woman who needs protection from her own poor judgment. You've made decisions about my social activities, offered unsolicited advice about my finances, and generally behaved as if my intelligence had died along with your father. Diane bristled. We were trying to help. You were grieving and struggling with basic tasks. Yes, I was. For about 6 months. But grief and incompetence aren't the same thing, and temporary vulnerability doesn't equal permanent incapacity. Marcus set down the bank statements. So you've been lying to us for 2 years. I've been allowing you to maintain your assumptions, rather than challenging them directly. There's a difference. Is there though? His voice carried an edge of anger that surprised me. You let us worry about your finances. You let us think you were living on a fixed income. Did I, or did you simply never ask about my current financial situation? This stopped him short. I realized they'd never actually inquired about my income or expenses since those first months after Harold's death. They'd assumed my circumstances were static, that a widow's financial picture couldn't change or improve over time. Diane was studying one of the bank statements more carefully. Dorothy, this account shows a balance of over $400,000. Yes, that's my tournament account. It doesn't include my other investments or my regular checking and savings. Other investments. Marcus echoed weakly. I retrieved another folder from my desk, this one containing quarterly statements from my brokerage account. I've been working with a financial advisor for the past year. We've invested a portion of my winnings in diversified portfolios. The numbers on these statements were even more impressive than the tournament account. Conservative investments in index funds and municipal bonds had grown steadily, compounded by regular contributions from my gambling winnings.
Jesus, Mom, Marcus whispered, calculating the totals. You're worth more than $1 million. Closer to 1.4 million, actually, if you include the house and my retirement accounts. They sat in shocked silence, and I found myself studying their faces, trying to read their emotions. Surprise, certainly. Confusion, but also something that looked uncomfortably like resentment. I can't believe you didn't trust us enough to share this, Diane said finally. Trust wasn't the issue. Respect was. What does that mean? It means that every conversation we've had about my life has been filtered through your assumption that I'm incapable of making good decisions. You've never asked about my interests or goals. You've never inquired about whether I'm happy or fulfilled. You've treated me like a problem to be managed rather than a person with agency and intelligence. Marcus stood and began pacing my living room. That's not fair. We've been concerned about your welfare, have you? Or have you been concerned about your image as responsible adult children? This hit close to home, I could tell. Marcus stopped pacing and Diane's carefully composed expression faltered. When you visit, I continued, do you ask what I've been doing because you're genuinely interested? Or because you feel obligated to check on the elderly mother who might be declining? We care about you, Diane insisted. I'm sure you do, but caring about someone and respecting them are different things. For the past 3 years, you've cared about me the way you might care about a pet or a child, someone who needs supervision and protection but isn't capable of meaningful decision-making. Marcus returned to the sofa, his shoulders sagging. We just wanted to help, and I appreciated that help when I needed it. But I haven't needed it for quite some time, and you never noticed because you never looked. Diane was gathering up her papers, the articles about senior fraud that now seemed absurdly irrelevant. So what happens now? Now we figure out how to have an adult relationship based on mutual respect rather than your assumption of my incompetence. And the money? Marcus asked. What are your plans for it? This was the question I'd been expecting. Now that they knew about my wealth, they would inevitably begin thinking about how it might benefit them. The irony wasn't lost on me that their first concern after discovering my success was how it might serve their own interests. I have several ideas, I said carefully. Some charitable giving, some family gifts, some continued investment for long-term growth. But those decisions are mine to make. Of course, Marcus said quickly. We weren't suggesting otherwise, but his tone suggested exactly that. I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the mental spreadsheets adding up tuition costs and mortgage payments and retirement shortfalls. I do want to help with Sophia's education, I continued. She's a remarkable young woman with tremendous potential. But any assistance I provide will be a gift, not an expectation or entitlement. Diane nodded eagerly. That's very generous, Dorothy. It's an investment in someone I believe in, just like my tournament play has been an investment in skills and relationships I value. We talked for another hour, covering practical details and family dynamics with a stiffness that suggested we were all still processing this new reality. Marcus and Diane asked careful questions about my tournament schedule and travel plans, clearly struggling to reconcile their image of pathetic Tuesday night bingo with the sophisticated competition circuit I'd described. When they finally left, I felt emotionally drained but oddly relieved. The secret was out, at least partially. They now knew about my financial success, though I sensed they still didn't fully understand or appreciate the achievement it represented. That evening, Sophia called, her voice bubbling with excitement. Grandma, Dad told me about your conversation today. I can't believe you're like a professional gambler. Semi-professional, I corrected, smiling at her enthusiasm. And it's more about strategy and mathematics than luck. That's so cool. Can I come to a tournament with you sometime? Her genuine interest was refreshing after her parents' careful politeness. I'd love that, sweetheart. There's a regional competition in Milwaukee next weekend. It might be educational. Really? That would be amazing. We talked for nearly an hour about probability theory and pattern recognition, topics that fascinated her and reminded me why I'd been drawn to tournament play in the first place.
Unlike her parents, Sophia didn't seem threatened by my success or puzzled by my transformation. She was simply proud of her grandmother's achievements. The next few days brought a series of awkward phone calls from Marcus and Diane, conversations that felt like diplomatic negotiations between former adversaries. They were clearly recalibrating their approach to our relationship, though old habits of condescension proved difficult to break. "Mom," Marcus said during one of these calls, "Diane and I have been talking. We think it might be good for you to consider moving closer to us, especially now that you're traveling so much." "Why would that be good for me?" "Well, for security reasons. With all that money, you're more vulnerable to crime." The suggestion annoyed me more than it should have. Even knowing about my success, they still couldn't imagine that I might be capable of managing my own security and safety. "I've been living independently for 5 years without incident," I pointed out. "My current arrangements work well for my lifestyle. But what if something happened while you were away at a tournament? What if someone broke in? I have excellent security systems and trusted neighbors who watch the house when I travel. The same precautions any homeowner should take." There was a pause. "We're just worried about you. I understand your concern, but I'm not interested in relocating. This house is my home, and it's perfectly situated for my current activities." The conversation ended with polite but strained pleasantries, and I realized that our relationship would require ongoing negotiation. They were trying to adapt to the new reality, but years of established patterns would be difficult to change. The Milwaukee tournament provided a welcome distraction from family drama. Sophia accompanied me, her presence adding a new dimension to the competition. Watching the games through her eyes, explaining strategies and observing player dynamics, reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this world. The tournament itself went well. I placed second in the main event, earning $12,000 and won a smaller side tournament for an additional $3,000. More importantly, Sophia got to see me in my element, confident and skilled in an environment that valued intelligence and experience. "Grandma," she said during the drive home, "you're kind of a badass." I laughed, surprised by her assessment. "Is that your professional opinion?" "Definitely. Dad and Mom have no idea who you really are, do they? They're learning. It takes time to update your understanding of someone, especially when your initial assumptions were so far off." "Are you going to keep playing tournaments?" "As long as I'm enjoying them and performing well. This has become more than a hobby for me, Sophia. It's become part of who I am." She nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's awesome. I hope when I'm your age, I'm still discovering new things about myself." Her comment stayed with me as we completed the drive home. At 68, I had indeed discovered new aspects of my identity and capabilities. The question now was whether my family could accept and appreciate this evolution, or whether they would continue to see it as a deviation from their preferred version of who I should be. The following week brought another unexpected development. Diane called with what she clearly considered exciting news. "Dorothy, I've been researching senior living communities in our area. There are some lovely places that offer transportation services and social activities. I think you'd really enjoy the structure. I'm not interested in senior living communities, but think about the convenience. You wouldn't have to worry about home maintenance or driving to your bingo games. They have shuttle services to activities." The word bingo in her mouth still carried dismissive undertones, despite everything she'd learned about my success. In her mind, I was still playing recreational games with church ladies rather than competing in serious tournaments. "Diane, I appreciate your research, but I've already told you I'm not interested in relocating. It's just that with all the traveling you're doing, it seems impractical to maintain such a large house." "My house isn't large, and maintaining it isn't impractical. I enjoy my home and my independence. But what about when you get older?" "I am older. This is what older looks like for me. Active, engaged, and self-sufficient." There was a silence that suggested she was struggling with this concept. In Diane's worldview, aging was synonymous with decline, and independence at my age was somehow inappropriate or dangerous. "We're just thinking about your future," she said finally. "My future is my responsibility to plan and yours to respect." After hanging up, I realized that my family's adjustment to my new reality would be more complicated than I'd anticipated. Revealing my financial success had been the easy part. The harder challenge would be convincing them to see me as a competent adult, rather than a lucky but still vulnerable elderly woman who needed their oversight. That evening, I sat in my sunroom reviewing my tournament calendar for the coming months. Regional championships in 3 states, a national event in Nevada, and the winter circuit in Florida that I'd been looking forward to all year. This schedule represented more than entertainment or even income. It represented a life I'd built for myself, relationships I'd cultivated, and skills I'd developed through dedication and practice. My family would need to understand that this wasn't a phase or a temporary distraction from the serious business of aging gracefully. This was who I'd become, and who I intended to remain for as long as my mind and body would allow. Whether they could accept that truth would determine the future of our relationships. The phone rang, interrupting my planning. It was Frank Morrison, my mentor from the tournament circuit. "Dorothy," his familiar voice boomed through the phone, "I just heard about your win in Milwaukee. Congratulations." "Thank you, Frank. Sophia came with me this time. I think she's beginning to understand what we do." "Family coming around to your new career?" I considered the question carefully. "They're trying to. It's a process. It always is. Most people can't imagine that we're serious athletes in our own way. They think gambling is about luck and desperation instead of skill and strategy." "Exactly. My son actually thought I was being scammed when I mentioned helping with college tuition." Frank chuckled. "Classic. My kids went through the same thing when I started winning consistently. Now they brag about their father, the professional gambler." "How long did it take them to come around?" "About 2 years. But once they saw the checks clearing and the travel schedule I was maintaining, they had to admit this was legitimate." "Your family will get there too." After we hung up, I felt more optimistic about the future. Frank's experience suggested that family skepticism and concern were normal parts of this transition. With time and patience, Marcus and Diane would hopefully learn to see my achievements as victories rather than problems to be solved. But patience, I was discovering, was easier to maintain when you were winning $47,000 jackpots than when you were listening to suggestions about senior living communities and transportation services. The next few months would test whether my newfound confidence could withstand the pressure of family members who still couldn't quite believe that their pathetic bingo-playing mother had become more successful than they were. The crisis that would reshape everything began with a phone call at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. I was preparing for my weekly tournament in Cedar Rapids when Marcus's number flashed on my screen, an unusual time for him to call unless something was seriously wrong. "Mom, we have a situation." His voice was strained, almost frantic. "Diane's in the hospital." My heart jumped. "What happened? Is she okay?" "She had some kind of episode last night. Chest pains, difficulty breathing. We're at St. Mary's Hospital downtown. I'll be right there." "No, wait. That's not why I'm calling." His voice took on that familiar controlling tone. "The doctors want to keep her for observation, maybe surgery. The thing is, our insurance has a massive deductible, and with Sophia's tuition already straining us financially, I understood immediately where this was heading. After months of tiptoeing around my wealth, he was finally ready to ask for money directly. "How much do you need?" "The surgery alone could be $30,000, maybe more, plus lost income while she recovers. We're looking at $50,000 or $60,000 total. Consider it handled," I said without hesitation. "I'll transfer the money this morning." There was a pause. "Just like that. Diane's health is more important than money, Marcus. Family emergencies are exactly why I've been building financial security." "Thank you, Mom. I know we haven't always seen eye to eye lately, but this means everything." After hanging up, I canceled my tournament plans and drove to the hospital. Whatever tensions existed between us, Diane was family and I genuinely cared about her well-being. I found Marcus in the cardiac wing waiting room, looking haggard and worried. "Any updates?" I asked, settling beside him. "They're running more tests. The initial blood work shows some concerning markers." He rubbed his face tiredly. "I keep thinking about how much time we've wasted arguing about stupid things when life is so fragile." I patted his hand. "We'll have plenty of time to work through our differences. Right now, let's focus on getting Diane healthy." Over the next 3 days, I essentially moved into the hospital waiting room. Diane's condition was serious but stable, requiring a procedure to clear blocked arteries, but with excellent prognosis for full recovery. Marcus seemed genuinely grateful for my presence and support, and for brief moments our relationship felt natural again. It was during one of these moments, while Diane was sleeping and we sat quietly in her room, that Marcus brought up something that would change everything. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Of course, all this money you've been winning at bingo tournaments, are you reporting it properly on your taxes? The question caught me off guard. Yes, absolutely. I work with a CPA who specializes in gambling income. Everything is documented and reported correctly. And you're sure you understand the tax implications, because gambling winnings are taxed differently than regular income. I'm aware of that, Marcus. Why are you asking? He shifted uncomfortably. Diane mentioned something before her surgery. She said you might be getting in over your head financially, making decisions without understanding the consequences. I felt my protective instincts rising. What kind of decisions? Well, like offering to pay $60,000 for her medical bills without even thinking about it. She was worried that you might be spending money you don't actually have. The irony was breathtaking. Even after seeing my bank statements, even after learning about my investment portfolio, Diane still believed I was financially incompetent. And now she was planting seeds of doubt in Marcus's mind during her own medical crisis. Marcus, I showed you my financial records. You know exactly what I can afford. I know what those statements said, but Diane thinks they might not tell the whole story. Like maybe there are debts or obligations we don't know about. Such as, well, gambling debts for one thing. High-stakes players sometimes get in with dangerous people. I stared at him. You think I owe money to loan sharks? I don't know what to think, Mom. This whole professional gambling thing is outside my experience. For all I know, you could owe hundreds of thousands to casinos or other players. Marcus, I play bingo, not poker in back rooms. The tournaments are legitimate competitions run by licensed organizations. There are no loan sharks or dangerous people involved. But how do I know that for sure? How do I know you're not in some kind of trouble you're too embarrassed to tell us about? The conversation was spiraling into territory that felt both familiar and infuriating. Despite everything I'd shown them, despite the evidence of my success and competence, they were still more comfortable believing I was a victim than acknowledging I was accomplished. You could know it for sure by trusting me when I tell you, I said carefully. Or by doing basic research about the organizations I compete with. Or by accompanying me to a tournament and seeing for yourself how legitimate and professional they are. We're just concerned about you taking on financial obligations when your situation might be more precarious than you realize. My situation isn't precarious, Marcus. Your situation is precarious. I'm offering to help because I can afford to and because I care about Diane's health. But what if you're wrong about what you can afford? Then that's my mistake to make. I'm an adult, and I'm capable of managing my own finances. He fell silent, but I could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. Part of him wanted to accept my help gratefully and move forward. Another part couldn't let go of the need to protect me from myself, even when that protection was neither needed nor wanted. The next morning brought a more serious development. I was in the hospital cafeteria getting coffee when Sophia found me, her expression grim. Grandma, I need to tell you something about what Dad and Mom have been discussing. What kind of discussion? Last night when you went home to shower and change clothes, they had a long conversation about your finances. Mom thinks you're in denial about being in debt to gambling organizations. That's ridiculous. I know that and you know that, but they've convinced themselves that you're either being scammed or hiding debts. Worse, they've decided they need to intervene before you get in deeper trouble. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. What kind of intervention? They're talking about having you declared financially incompetent. Mom found some lawyer who specializes in elder law, and apparently there's a process for taking control of someone's finances if you can prove they're making irrational decisions. The words hit me like a physical blow. They want to take away my financial autonomy. Dad thinks it would be temporary, just until they can sort out your real financial situation and make sure you're not being exploited. I set down my coffee cup, my hands shaking slightly. And you, what do you think about this plan? I think they're insane. You're the sharpest person I know, and your tournament success proves you're excellent at calculating risks and managing money. But they're scared because they don't understand what you're doing. Fear doesn't justify trying to strip away my legal rights. I agree, that's why I'm telling you. I think you need to know what you're dealing with. We talked for another 20 minutes, with Sophia providing details about her parents' research into guardianship proceedings and financial competency evaluations. The picture she painted was terrifying. Marcus and Diane had apparently spent considerable time researching how to have an elderly person declared incapable of managing their own affairs. When I returned to Diane's room, I found myself looking at Marcus with new eyes. Was this the same person who'd gratefully accepted my offer to pay for his wife's medical care just 3 days earlier? How had gratitude transformed so quickly into a plan to take control of my life? "How's Diane feeling this morning?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Much better. The doctor thinks she'll be ready for discharge tomorrow." He paused. "Mom, we need to have a serious conversation about your finances." "Do we?" "Yes. Diane and I have been talking and we think you might benefit from some professional guidance. Someone who understands gambling income and can help you develop a sustainable long-term plan." "I already work with financial professionals, Marcus. I have a CPA, a financial advisor and an estate attorney. But do they understand the specific risks associated with gambling income? The feast or famine nature of tournament winnings? They understand that my income is variable and have helped me plan accordingly. That's why I have diverse investments and substantial liquid savings. We just think a second opinion might be valuable. Someone who could independently verify that your financial picture is as solid as you believe it to be." The word independently was telling. He wanted verification from someone he chose, someone who might be more likely to share his skepticism about my competence. "Marcus, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not interested in having my financial decisions reviewed by anyone you select. If you have specific questions about my assets or obligations, I'm happy to discuss them directly." "But that's the problem, Mom. We can't tell if you're being completely honest with us or if you're hiding problems you're embarrassed about." The accusation stung. "When have I ever lied to you about anything important?" "Well, you hid your gambling activities for 2 years. I maintained privacy about activities you'd made clear you didn't respect or understand. That's different from lying." "Is it though? If you could hide something that's significant, what else might you be hiding?" The conversation continued in circles, with Marcus raising hypothetical concerns and me attempting to address them with facts and documentation. But I gradually realized that facts weren't really the issue. The issue was control, and specifically their discomfort with me having control over my own life and resources. That evening, after visiting hours ended, I drove home and sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, trying to process the day's revelations. My son and daughter-in-law were planning to have me declared financially incompetent, ostensibly for my own protection. The irony was staggering. I was more financially secure than I'd ever been in my life, more intellectually engaged, more socially connected. Yet they saw my success as evidence of problems that required their intervention. The phone rang, interrupting my brooding. It was Frank Morrison, calling with news about an upcoming tournament. "Dorothy, there's been a last-minute addition to the Nevada circuit. A high-stakes invitational with a guaranteed first prize of $100,000. Are you interested?" Under normal circumstances, I would have been thrilled by the opportunity. But given the current family crisis, the idea of traveling to a major tournament felt fraught with complications. "I'm not sure I can commit right now, Frank. I have some family issues that need attention." "Everything okay?" I found myself explaining the situation, including Marcus and Diane's suspicions about my finances and their apparent plan to seek guardianship. Frank listened with growing incredulity. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," he said when I finished. "You're one of the most successful players on the circuit. Your bankroll management is textbook perfect. They don't understand what we do, Frank. To them, all gambling looks the same. Have you considered involving your attorney in this? If they're seriously pursuing guardianship, you need legal protection." "I've thought about it, but I keep hoping we can resolve this as a family without involving courts and lawyers." "Dorothy, with all due respect, they've already involved lawyers. That elder law attorney your granddaughter mentioned. They're not researching guardianship proceedings out of idle curiosity." Frank was right, and I knew it. While I was trying to handle this diplomatically, Marcus and Diane were building a legal case against my competency. My desire to avoid confrontation was putting me at a serious disadvantage. "What would you do in my situation?" I asked. "I'd get my own attorney immediately, and I'd document everything. Every conversation, every accusation, every attempt to undermine your autonomy. If this goes to court, you'll need evidence that their concerns are unfounded and that you're fully capable of managing your affairs. After we hung up, I spent the evening researching elder law and guardianship proceedings. What I learned was sobering. In many cases, the threshold for declaring someone financially incompetent was surprisingly low. Family members who could demonstrate a pattern of unusual financial decisions might be able to convince a court that intervention was necessary, even if the person's overall financial health was excellent. The next morning, I called my estate attorney, Patricia Williamson, and scheduled an emergency consultation. Patricia had handled Harold's estate and my own will, and I trusted her judgment completely. "Dorothy," she said after I explained the situation, "this is more serious than you might realize. Guardianship proceedings can be initiated relatively easily, and once they begin, the burden of proof shifts to you to demonstrate your competency. But I have extensive documentation of my financial success and careful planning." "That's good, but it may not be enough. Courts tend to be conservative when it comes to elderly people and gambling activities. Your family could argue that gambling itself indicates impaired judgment, regardless of your success rate. So what do you recommend?" "First, we need to document your competency thoroughly. I'm going to refer you to a geriatric psychiatrist who can conduct a comprehensive evaluation of your mental capacity. Second, we need to gather evidence of your financial acumen, including detailed records of your tournament performance and investment strategies. And third, we may need to consider taking preemptive legal action. If we can demonstrate to a court that you're fully competent and that your family's concerns are unfounded, we might be able to prevent them from initiating guardianship proceedings." The consultation lasted 2 hours and covered scenarios I'd never imagined having to consider. By the end, I had a clear action plan but also a sobering understanding of how quickly my carefully constructed independence could be destroyed by well-meaning family members who couldn't accept my transformation. That afternoon, I returned to the hospital for what I'd decided would be my final visit until Diane was discharged. I found her sitting up in bed, looking much improved with Marcus in the chair beside her. "Dorothy," Diane said warmly, "Marcus told me about your generous offer to help with the medical bills. I can't tell you how much that means to us. I'm glad I can help. How are you feeling?" "Much better. The doctor says I should be able to go home tomorrow." We chatted pleasantly for a few minutes about her recovery timeline and follow-up care. Then Diane brought up the topic I'd been dreading. "Dorothy, Marcus and I have been talking about your situation. We're worried that you might be taking on more financial risk than you realize." "What kind of risk?" "Well, offering to pay for my medical care without any hesitation suggests you might not be fully considering the implications. What if you need that money for your own healthcare emergencies?" "I've planned for those contingencies, Diane. Healthcare costs are part of any retirement budget. But are you sure you've planned adequately? Gambling income is unpredictable, and medical costs can escalate quickly." Marcus leaned forward. "We've been researching elder financial planning. There are specialists who understand the unique challenges faced by seniors with variable income streams. I appreciate your research, but I'm satisfied with my current financial management. The thing is," Diane continued, "we've found someone who might be able to provide a second opinion. Just to give us all peace of mind that your situation is as secure as you believe it to be." "I don't need a second opinion, but what if you're wrong?" Marcus asked. "What if there are risks or obligations you haven't considered? Wouldn't it be better to know now, while there's time to make adjustments?" I looked at both of them, seeing the careful coordination in their approach. This wasn't a spontaneous conversation. They'd planned this discussion, probably with input from the elder law attorney Sophia had mentioned. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. "Just a consultation with a financial planner who specializes in senior issues," Marcus said, "someone who can review your entire financial picture and provide an independent assessment. And if this person concludes that my finances are perfectly sound, then we'll stop worrying and support your decisions completely." Diane assured me, "And if they have concerns, then we'll work together to address them," Marcus said. The trap was elegantly constructed. If I agreed to their evaluation, I'd be submitting to their judgment about my competency. If I refused, They could use that refusal as evidence that I was hiding problems or lacked insight into my situation. I need to think about this, I said finally. Of course, we're not trying to pressure you. We just want what's best for everyone. As I drove home from the hospital, I realized that my family's intervention had moved beyond concern into active planning. They'd identified an expert who would review my finances, presumably someone predisposed to find problems with gambling-based income. They'd researched the legal framework for guardianship proceedings. And they'd coordinated their approach to present a united front. What they hadn't considered was that I might have resources and expertise of my own. That evening, I called Patricia Williamson again. Patricia, I need to accelerate our timeline. I think my family is planning to move forward with their intervention more quickly than we anticipated. What's changed? I described my conversation with Marcus and Diane, including their insistence on an independent financial evaluation. That's definitely a red flag, Patricia agreed. They're building a case for incompetency by creating a paper trail of their reasonable attempts to help you make better decisions. So what do? We get ahead of them. Tomorrow, I'm filing paperwork to establish a formal declaration of your competency. We'll include the psychiatric evaluation I mentioned, plus comprehensive documentation of your financial success and planning. If they try to initiate guardianship proceedings, we'll already have court records establishing your mental capacity. Will that be enough? It should be, especially given your demonstrated financial acumen. But Dorothy, you need to understand this will probably end your relationship with Marcus and Diane permanently. Once we file these papers, there's no going back to family harmony. I thought about this soberly. For the past few months, I'd been hoping we could navigate our differences through patience and gradual understanding. But their willingness to pursue legal action against me had changed the stakes fundamentally. What's the alternative? I asked. Submit to their evaluation and hope their expert reaches favorable conclusions. But that puts your autonomy entirely in the hands of someone they've chosen, someone who may be biased toward finding problems with your lifestyle choices. Then we file the papers. I'd rather lose my relationship with Marcus and Diane than lose my independence. I'll start the process first thing tomorrow morning. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen one more time, this time with a sense of finality rather than uncertainty. Tomorrow would begin a legal battle that would determine whether I remained in control of my own life or became a ward of family members who couldn't accept my transformation from dependent widow to successful competitor. The phone rang again. This time it was Sophia. Grandma, I heard about the conversation at the hospital today. Are you okay? I'm managing, sweetheart. Though I think your parents and I are heading for a serious confrontation. I'm so sorry. I never thought they'd actually follow through on the guardianship idea. Sometimes people surprise us, not always in good ways. Is there anything I can do to help? I considered this carefully. Sophia was 18, legally an adult, but still dependent on her parents for college support. Taking sides in this conflict could jeopardize her education and family relationships. The best thing you can do is stay out of it, I said finally. This is between your parents and me. But it's not fair. You're the most competent person I know. Fairness isn't always the determining factor in family disputes. Sometimes people do things they believe are right even when they're completely wrong. Will you keep me informed about what happens? Of course. But Sophia, you need to understand that this situation may get very ugly very quickly. Your parents are going to say things about me that aren't true, and I'm going to have to defend myself in ways that might be hard for you to watch.
I can handle it, Grandma. I know who you really are. Her loyalty was touching, but I hoped she wouldn't be forced to choose between her parents and her grandmother in any formal or public way. Family conflicts that escalated to legal proceedings had a way of destroying relationships that seemed solid. That night, I barely slept. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of the most serious challenge to my independence since Harold's death. But unlike those early months of grief and confusion, I wouldn't be facing this challenge alone or unprepared. I had resources, expertise, and most importantly, a clear understanding of what was at stake. The pathetic bingo-playing widow Marcus and Diane thought they were protecting no longer existed. In her place was a woman who'd built a new life through intelligence, skill, and determination. Whether they liked it or not,
They were about to discover just how effectively I could defend that life when it was threatened. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows across the participants' faces. I sat beside Patricia Williamson, my hands folded calmly in my lap, while across the aisle Marcus and Diane huddled with their attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Victoria Chen who specialized in elder guardianship cases. Judge Margaret Foster, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes, reviewed the paperwork spread before her. The hearing had been scheduled after Marcus and Diane filed their petition for limited guardianship, claiming I was making irrational financial decisions that put my well-being at risk. My counter-petition for a formal declaration of competency had created what Patricia called a fascinating legal chess match. "This is highly unusual," Judge Foster began, looking between the two legal teams. "We have dueling competency claims about the same individual. Mrs. Chen, you're alleging that Dorothy Chen is incapable of managing her finances due to gambling addiction and impaired judgment. Miss Williamson, you're asserting that Mrs. Chen is fully competent and that her family's concerns are unfounded. Let's start with the petitioners." Victoria Chen stood, her posture radiating confidence. "Your Honor, this case represents a classic example of late-onset gambling addiction combined with age-related cognitive decline. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, 68 years old, has been engaging in high-stakes gambling activities that her family believes indicate serious impairment in judgment." She gestured toward a stack of documents. "The evidence shows that Mrs. Chen has been traveling extensively to gambling venues, spending thousands of dollars on entry fees, and claiming winnings that her family questions the veracity of. More concerning, when her son and daughter-in-law expressed legitimate concerns about her activities, she became secretive and defensive, classic signs of addiction and denial. I listened to this characterization of my life with a mixture of anger and amazement. Victoria Chen had taken the facts of my tournament success and reframed them as evidence of pathology. My travels became compulsive gambling, my privacy became secrecy, and my defensive responses to their accusations became proof of mental decline. Furthermore, Chen continued, Mrs. Chen recently offered to pay $60,000 for her daughter-in-law's medical expenses without any apparent consideration of her own financial limitations. This impulsive generosity, while well-intentioned, demonstrates a lack of realistic assessment of her resources and future needs. Judge Foster made notes as Chen spoke. "Do you have evidence of actual financial harm or depletion of assets?" "That's precisely the problem, Your Honor. Mrs. Chen claims to have substantial assets, but she's been evasive about providing complete documentation to her family. We believe she may be hiding debts or obligations related to her gambling activities." "Have you requested financial records through discovery?" "We have, and what we've received raises more questions than it answers. Bank statements showing large irregular deposits that could easily be fabricated. Investment accounts that appeared suddenly after years of modest retirement income. The pattern suggests either fraud or serious impairment in Mrs. Chen's ability to distinguish reality from fantasy." Patricia stood to respond. "Your Honor, may I address these allegations immediately? They're based on assumptions rather than evidence." "Proceed, Miss Williamson. Mrs. Chen's financial records are not fabricated or suspicious. They document a remarkable but entirely legitimate success in tournament bingo competition. We have corroborating evidence from tournament organizers, tax records showing proper reporting of gambling income, and independent verification of her investment strategies." Patricia moved to our table and retrieved a thick folder. "We've prepared comprehensive documentation of Mrs. Chen's competency, including a recent psychiatric evaluation by Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a geriatric psychiatrist, who found no evidence of cognitive impairment, addiction, or poor judgment." She handed copies to the court and to Victoria Chen. "Dr. Morrison's report specifically addresses the question of gambling addiction. Mrs. Chen's approach to tournament play demonstrates sophisticated risk management, mathematical understanding, and strategic thinking. Her success rate and bankroll management are consistent with professional-level gambling, not compulsive behavior." Judge Foster reviewed the psychiatric report, while both attorneys waited. Dr. Morrison concludes that Mrs. Chen shows exceptional cognitive function for her age group and demonstrates clear understanding of financial risk and reward structures. She found no evidence of addiction, compulsion, or impaired judgment. With respect, Your Honor, Victoria Chen interjected, psychiatric evaluations can be influenced by the subject's ability to present themselves favorably during a brief examination. The real test is behavioral patterns over time. Which brings us to the core issue, Patricia replied. What behavioral patterns are we actually discussing? Mrs. Chen has successfully managed her finances for 5 years since her husband's death. She's built substantial assets through skilled competition and conservative investment. She maintains her home, travels safely, and makes sound financial decisions. The only concerning behavior her family can identify is that she's been successful at something they don't understand. The judge leaned back in her chair. I'd like to hear from Mrs. Chen directly. Ma'am, would you please explain your tournament activities and how you view your own competency? I stood feeling the weight of this moment. Everything I'd built since Harold's death was being judged by a stranger who would determine whether I retained control over my own life. Your Honor, 5 years ago I was a grieving widow who depended on my family for basic decision-making. I'm grateful for their support during that difficult time. But grief isn't permanent, and dependence isn't my natural state. I paused, gathering my thoughts. I discovered tournament bingo by accident, but I pursued it seriously because I recognized I had natural abilities in pattern recognition and risk assessment. Over 2 years, I've competed in dozens of tournaments across the Midwest, building skills and success rates that most professional gamblers would envy. Can you explain your financial management approach? I treat tournament play as a business. I maintain detailed records of expenses and winnings, work with professional advisors for tax planning and investment, and never risk more than I can afford to lose. My bankroll management is conservative, designed to withstand inevitable losing streaks while maximizing long-term growth potential. Judge Foster made more notes. How do you respond to your family's concerns about your activities? I understand their concerns, but I believe they're based on outdated assumptions about my capabilities. When they see an elderly woman traveling to gambling venues, they imagine someone being exploited or making poor decisions. They can't conceive that I might be the one doing the exploiting, in the best sense of using superior skills to generate income. And the offer to pay for medical expenses. I offered to help because I could afford to, and because family health emergencies take priority over money. I've built substantial financial reserves specifically for unexpected expenses, whether my own or my family's. Victoria Chen requested permission to cross-examine me, which Judge Foster granted. Mrs. Chen, how much money have you spent on tournament entry fees in the past year? Approximately $15,000. And how much have you won? Approximately $87,000. You understand that gambling winnings are taxable income. Yes, and I've reported every dollar to the IRS, working with a CPA who specializes in gambling taxation. But isn't it true that you could lose everything just as quickly as you've won it? I could, which is why I've invested the majority of my winnings in conservative portfolios and maintain substantial cash reserves. But the same risk exists for any business or investment activity. Do you consider yourself addicted to gambling? No more than a successful day trader is addicted to stock transactions, or a professional athlete is addicted to competition. I engage in an activity I'm skilled at because it's profitable and enjoyable. Victoria Chen continued her questioning for 20 minutes, trying to establish that my confidence was delusional, or that my financial planning was inadequate. But my answers were consistent and well-reasoned, supported by documentation that Patricia had prepared meticulously. When the cross-examination ended, Judge Foster called for a recess to review all materials. During the break, I sat with Patricia in the courthouse cafeteria, trying to read her assessment of how the hearing was proceeding. How do you think it's going? I asked. Better than I expected. Judge Foster seems genuinely curious about your tournament activities rather than dismissive. And Victoria Chen's questions actually highlighted your competency rather than undermining it. What about Marcus and Diane? How do they seem? I glanced across the cafeteria, where my son and daughter-in-law sat with their attorney, their expressions grim. They look like they're realizing this isn't going according to plan. Probably because it isn't.
They expected you to come across as a confused elderly woman making poor decisions. Instead, you're presenting as a sharp, successful businesswoman who happens to be competing in an unconventional field. When court resumed, Judge Foster announced her decision to hear testimony from Dr. Morrison and to review additional financial documentation before making a ruling. She also granted Patricia's request to have Frank Morrison, my mentor from the tournament circuit, testify about the legitimacy and professional nature of competitive bingo. Dr. Morrison testified first, explaining her comprehensive evaluation process and her conclusions about my mental capacity. Mrs. Chen performed exceptionally well on all cognitive assessments, she told the court. Her memory, reasoning ability, and judgment are all well above average for her age group. I found no evidence of any condition that would impair her decision-making capacity. Frank Morrison's testimony proved even more compelling. As a 15-year veteran of the tournament circuit with documented winnings exceeding $200,000, he provided credibility that countered any suggestion that my activities were illegitimate or unusual. Mrs. Chen is one of the most skilled players I've encountered, Frank explained. Her mathematical approach to the game and her disciplined bankroll management are textbook examples of professional gambling technique. She's not a compulsive gambler any more than a successful poker player or sports bettor is compulsive. In your opinion, Judge Foster asked, is Mrs. Chen's level of success sustainable? Absolutely. She has the skills and temperament to compete successfully for many years. Tournament bingo rewards experience and strategic thinking, advantages that actually increase with age. Victoria Chen's cross-examination of Frank focused on the inherent risks of gambling, but his responses consistently emphasized the professional, business-like approach that serious tournament players maintain. After both sides presented closing arguments, Judge Foster announced she would issue a written ruling within 1 week. The hearing had lasted most of the day, and I felt emotionally drained as Patricia and I gathered our materials. In the courthouse parking lot, Marcus approached me alone while Diane waited by their car. Mom, I want you to know this isn't personal. We really believed we were protecting you. I know you did, Marcus, but protection shouldn't require destroying someone's autonomy. If the judge rules in your favor, what happens to us, to our relationship? It was a fair question, and one I'd been considering throughout this ordeal. That depends on whether you can accept that I'm not the helpless widow you've been trying to protect. It's just hard to reconcile the mother I've known my whole life with this person who travels around winning gambling tournaments. People change, Marcus.
Growth doesn't stop at retirement age. He nodded slowly. I guess I never considered that possibility. Maybe that's something we can work on if you're willing. The judge's ruling arrived by mail the following Friday. Patricia called immediately after receiving her copy. Complete victory, she announced. Judge Foster not only denied their guardianship petition, but specifically found that your financial management demonstrates exceptional competency and sophisticated planning. She criticized their petition as based on ageist assumptions rather than evidence of actual impairment. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, feeling relief wash over me. So it's over. It's over. You retain complete control over your finances and personal decisions. More importantly, this ruling creates a legal precedent that would make any future competency challenges extremely difficult. That evening, Sophia called to congratulate me on the victory. Grandma, I never doubted you'd win, but I'm so relieved it's finally over. How are your parents handling the news? Not great. They're embarrassed and frustrated. But I think they're also beginning to understand that they seriously misjudged you. It will take time for everyone to adjust to this new reality. Are you going back to tournaments now? Next week, actually. There's a regional championship in Kansas City that I've been looking forward to. Can I come watch sometime? I'd love that, sweetheart. 3 months later, I was sitting in the Riverside Community Center where my bingo journey had begun, playing in the weekly Tuesday night game that had started everything. Betty, my neighbor who'd first invited me, was incredulous when I told her about my tournament success and the legal battle that had ensued. Dorothy, I had no idea you were such a high roller, she said, daubing her cards with characteristic intensity. I'm the same person I've always been, Betty. I just discovered some talents I didn't know I had. The evening's jackpot was modest by tournament standards, only $300, but I found myself enjoying the relaxed atmosphere and friendly competition. This was where it all started. in a simple community center with folding tables and volunteers calling numbers. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Mom, Diane and I would like to take you to dinner this weekend if you're available. We owe you an apology and a real conversation. I typed back, I'd like that very much. The road to rebuilding our relationship would be long and probably difficult. They would need to learn to see me as an independent adult rather than a dependent parent. I would need to learn to forgive their attempt to control my life, understanding that it came from love even if it was misguided, but the foundation was there. Family bonds that could survive a court battle might be strong enough to handle the ongoing challenge of accepting each other's evolution. My name was called for a coverall, and I looked down to see that I'd won the evening's jackpot. As applause filled the room and I made my way to collect my winnings, I thought about how far I'd traveled from that first Tuesday night when I'd nervously clutched 4 bingo cards and hoped to win enough for a nice dinner. Now I was a tournament champion, a successful investor and a woman who'd successfully defended her autonomy against family members who thought they knew what was best for her. The $300 prize seemed almost quaint compared to the $50,000 jackpots I'd grown accustomed to, but it represented something equally valuable: the reminder that my journey had begun with curiosity and courage, qualities that would serve me well whatever challenges lay ahead. 6 months after the court ruling, I received an unexpected phone call from Victoria Chen, the attorney who'd represented Marcus and Diane in their guardianship petition. Mrs. Chen, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to reach out personally. Of course, what can I do for you? I've been following your tournament success since our court case, and I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your activities based on stereotypes about elderly people and gambling. I was wrong. Her admission surprised me. I appreciate you saying that. More than that, I'd like to ask if you'd consider speaking to a conference of elder law attorneys next month. Your case has made me reconsider how we approach competency questions, especially when unconventional activities are involved. What would you want me to talk about? The importance of understanding that competency isn't about conforming to expected behaviors. That seniors can develop new skills, pursue new interests, and make decisions that seem unusual but are actually well-reasoned. I agreed to speak at the conference, seeing it as an opportunity to help other seniors who might face similar challenges from well-meaning family members. My presentation, titled "Competency Isn't Conformity," was well received and led to invitations to speak at similar events across the region. The irony wasn't lost on me that my legal victory had opened up yet another unexpected career path. Just as discovering tournament bingo had revealed talents I didn't know I possessed, defending my autonomy in court had shown me I could be an effective advocate for senior independence. Marcus and Diane gradually adjusted to my new reality. Our dinner conversations began including updates about my tournament schedule and investment performance. They still sometimes slipped into protective mode, offering unsolicited advice about travel safety or financial planning, but they caught themselves more quickly and apologized when I pointed out their assumptions. The real breakthrough came when Sophia graduated from Northwestern, an achievement made possible partly by my financial support. During her graduation party, Marcus stood to make a toast. "I want to thank everyone who helped Sophia reach this milestone," he began. Her teachers, her friends, her family, and especially her grandmother, who has taught all of us that it's never too late to discover new talents or pursue new dreams. He looked directly at me. "Mom, I'm sorry it took us so long to understand that your bingo tournaments weren't a hobby or a problem to be solved. They were evidence of skills and determination that we should have celebrated from the beginning." The applause that followed felt different from the polite acknowledgement I'd grown accustomed to at family gatherings. This was genuine recognition and respect, emotions I'd almost given up hope of receiving from my son and daughter-in-law. Later that evening, as guests mingled and Sophia showed off her diploma, I found myself standing alone on Marcus and Diane's back deck, looking up at the stars and thinking about Harold. He would have been proud of what I'd accomplished, both in tournament competition and in standing up for my independence. But more than that, he would have been proud that I'd continued growing and learning long after most people assume such development stops. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was Frank Morrison with news about the upcoming national championships. "Dorothy, the entry deadline is next week. Are you planning to compete?"
Absolutely, I wouldn't miss it. Excellent. I think this could be your year to take the top prize. As we discussed strategy and travel plans, I realized that my conversation with Frank represented everything my family had initially failed to understand about my tournament activities. This wasn't mindless gambling or pathetic entertainment for lonely seniors. This was serious competition between skilled practitioners, no different from chess tournaments or bridge competitions or any other arena where intelligence and experience determine success. The difference was that my arena happened to involve gambling, an activity that triggered assumptions and prejudices that nearly cost me my independence. But those assumptions had been overcome by evidence and determination, leaving me free to continue pursuing excellence in a field I'd discovered by accident and mastered through dedication. Tomorrow I would begin preparing for the national championships, studying probability tables and refining strategies that had already brought me more success than I'd ever imagined possible. Next month I would speak to another conference of attorneys about senior competency and independence. And next year I would continue building a life that defied every stereotype about aging and limitation. The pathetic bingo nights my family had once dismissed had become the foundation for a transformation none of us could have predicted. In defending my right to pursue that transformation, I'd discovered reserves of strength and determination that served me well beyond the tournament circuit. Standing under the stars, thinking about past victories and future challenges, I smiled at the memory of that first Tuesday night when Betty had invited me to try something new. That simple invitation had led to achievements, relationships, and adventures that had redefined my understanding of what was possible in the later chapters of life. The best part was that this was still only the beginning. At 68, I'd learned that age was just a number, that competency wasn't about conforming to expectations, and that family love, while sometimes misguided, could ultimately grow to encompass even the most surprising transformations. The National Championship Tournament in Las Vegas represented everything I'd worked toward over the past 3 years. The ballroom at the Bellagio was massive, filled with hundreds of tables arranged in precise rows, each equipped with electronic daubing systems and overhead monitors displaying progressive jackpot amounts. The energy was electric, with players from across North America converging for 3 days of intense competition. I'd arrived 2 days early to acclimate to the environment and review my strategy notes. My hotel room overlooked the Strip, a view that would have seemed impossibly glamorous to the grieving widow I'd been just a few years earlier. Now it felt like a natural extension of the life I'd built through skill and determination. Frank Morrison found me in the hotel restaurant on the morning of the first day's competition. At 75, he moved more slowly than when we'd first met, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. Nervous, he asked, settling into the booth across from me. Excited, I corrected. I've been preparing for this level of competition for months. The field is stronger this year. Several players from the European circuit made the trip, plus some young hotshots who've been dominating the online qualifiers. I nodded, having studied the competition roster extensively. Youth brings speed and reflexes. Experience brings pattern recognition and emotional control. I'll take experience. The first day's events were preliminary rounds designed to eliminate roughly half the field. I played conservatively, focusing on consistency rather than spectacular wins. By evening, I'd advanced to the second day with a respectable middle-tier ranking that positioned me well for the more substantial prize pools ahead. During the dinner break, I was surprised to see a familiar face in the tournament lounge. Victoria Chen, the attorney who'd represented Marcus and Diane in their guardianship attempt, approached my table with obvious hesitation. "Mrs. Chen, I hope I'm not intruding. I'm here with my mother, who qualified through the California Regional Circuit." I gestured to an empty chair. "Please, join me. How is your mother doing in the competition?" "She made it through today's elimination rounds. She's 73 and started playing tournaments after her retirement from teaching. I never understood her interest until I started researching your case." Victoria's presence here represented a full-circle moment that I hadn't anticipated. The attorney who'd argued I was mentally incompetent was now watching her own elderly mother compete in the same tournaments I'd been accused of pursuing irrationally. "Has your perspective on senior gambling activities changed?" I asked. "Completely. Watching these players, seeing the level of skill and strategy involved, I realize how wrong I was about your situation. This isn't recreational bingo in a church basement. This is serious competition requiring mathematical sophistication and mental discipline. What does your mother think about your involvement in our legal case? Victoria winced slightly. She was appalled when I told her. She said I demonstrated exactly the kind of ageist thinking that prevents seniors from being taken seriously in any endeavor that deviates from expected norms. We talked for nearly an hour about the tournament circuit, the skills required for success, and the broader issue of how society views elderly people who pursue unconventional activities. Victoria's transformation from adversary to advocate felt symbolic of the broader education process my family had undergone. The second day brought higher stakes and more intense competition. I found myself at a table with several players I'd competed against before, including Sarah Martinez from Phoenix, a retired mathematics professor who'd become one of my closest friends on the circuit. Sarah was 81 and had been playing professionally for over a decade, her success rate and tournament earnings serving as proof that age could be an advantage rather than limitation in activities requiring patience and analytical thinking. "Dorothy," she said during a break between sessions, "you're playing with unusual confidence today. Something's changed. The legal battle with my family is finally resolved. For the first time in years, I feel completely free to focus on competition without worrying about external judgment. Family acceptance makes everything easier. My children fought my tournament activities initially, but once they saw the financial results and met other players, they became supporters rather than critics." The day's main event was a progressive jackpot tournament, with a first prize of $150,000. The entry fee was substantial, $2,000, but the potential return justified the risk for players with sufficient bankroll and skill level. I advanced through 4 elimination rounds, my concentration absolute as I tracked multiple cards while monitoring other players' progress. The final table consisted of 8 players, including myself, Sarah, and a 28-year-old software engineer from Toronto, who'd gained attention for his mathematical approach to card selection. The tension in the room was palpable as we entered the championship round. Gallery seating had filled with other tournament participants, family members, and gambling industry professionals who followed high-stakes bingo competition. I spotted Frank in the front row, his expression intense as he watched his former student compete for the biggest prize of her career. The calling began at a deliberate pace that would accelerate as the game progressed. I'd selected my cards using probability algorithms I'd refined over months of competition, choosing combinations that maximized coverage while minimizing overlap. My daubing rhythm was steady and precise, muscle memory developed through hundreds of hours of practice. 20 numbers in, 3 players remained in contention for the coverall pattern required for victory. The young engineer had 2 cards with excellent potential, Sarah had 1 card that needed only 3 more numbers, and I had a card requiring 4 numbers, but with favorable probability distribution. The tension mounted as each called number eliminated possibilities and shifted odds. At 35 numbers called, Sarah's card was eliminated when a crucial number in the wrong column was drawn.
The competition narrowed to the software engineer and myself. Number 41 was called G52. My card needed it, his didn't. The gap narrowed to 3 numbers for me, 4 for him. Number 42, B8. Neither of us needed it, but the field of remaining numbers was shrinking, improving both our odds. Number 43, N38. He needed it desperately. I didn't. His chances improved significantly, while mine remained steady. The caller paused, building drama as the crowd leaned forward in anticipation. Number 44, 067. I looked down at my card and felt my heart race. 067 was one of my 3 remaining numbers, 2 numbers left for the championship. The software engineer studied his card intently, then shook his head slightly. He needed 3 more numbers now, while I needed only 2. The mathematical advantage had shifted decisively in my favor. Number 45, G59. Another number I needed. 1 remaining space on my card. Dozens of numbers still possible, but probability theory suggested the next few calls would determine the outcome. Number 46, B14. Not my number. The engineer checked his card hopefully, then sank back in disappointment. He needed B14, but it hadn't helped him. Number 47, I-25. My final number. I looked down at my card, seeing the completed pattern that represented 3 years of dedication, skill development, and strategic thinking. The room seemed to freeze for a moment, before I called out bingo, in a voice that carried across the entire ballroom. The verification process took several minutes as tournament officials confirmed my card against the called numbers. When they announced we have a winner, the applause was thunderous, but I barely heard it over the rush of emotions flooding through me. $150,000. The largest prize of my career, won in front of hundreds of witnesses who understood exactly what this achievement represented. As I walked to the podium to accept the ceremonial check, I thought about everyone who doubted my abilities, questioned my judgment, or dismissed my activities as pathetic entertainment for lonely seniors. The tournament director, a distinguished man in his 60s who'd been running major bingo events for decades, handed me the oversized check and leaned close to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, Dorothy Chen represents everything we celebrate about championship bingo: skill, strategy, dedication, and the understanding that excellence has no expiration date. Congratulations, Dorothy, on a masterful performance. The applause continued as photographers captured the moment, and other players offered congratulations. Frank made his way through the crowd, his eyes bright with pride and satisfaction. That was textbook perfect, he said, embracing me warmly. From card selection to execution, you played like a champion. I had an excellent teacher. You had natural talent that just needed proper development. This win establishes you as one of the elite players on the circuit. Later that evening, at the tournament's awards banquet, I sat at a table with Sarah, Frank, and several other veteran players who'd become my community over the past 3 years. The conversation flowed easily between strategy discussions, travel plans for upcoming tournaments, and personal updates about families and health. Victoria Chen approached our table during dessert, her mother beside her. Mrs. Chen was a small woman, with bright eyes and a confident handshake, who congratulated me warmly on my victory. I wanted to introduce my mother properly. Victoria said, she finished 15th overall, which is remarkable for only her second national championship. The competition was excellent, Mrs. Chen said. I learned a great deal watching the final table play. Your card selection strategy was particularly impressive. We discussed tournament technique for several minutes before Victoria's mother excused herself to join other California players. Victoria lingered at our table, clearly wanting to address the history between us. Mrs. Chen, I owe you more than an apology. Seeing this tournament, meeting these players, understanding what you've accomplished, I realize I was completely wrong about your competency and judgment. You were representing your clients' concerns as you understood them, I replied diplomatically. No, it was more than that. I made assumptions about elderly people and gambling that were both ignorant and prejudiced. Your family's concerns might have been understandable, but my legal strategy was based on stereotypes rather than evidence. What matters is that you've learned from the experience. Hopefully that will help other seniors who face similar challenges. Actually, that's something I wanted to discuss with you. Would you consider co-authoring an article about this case for the Elder Law Journal? I think our perspectives together could help attorneys and families understand these issues better. I agreed to consider the collaboration, seeing it as an opportunity to reach professionals who might encounter similar situations in their practice. The legal case that had nearly destroyed my independence could become a tool for protecting other seniors' autonomy. The flight home to Chicago gave me time to process everything that had happened over the past week. The tournament victory was satisfying both financially and personally, but the broader implications felt even more significant. I'd proven to myself and others that my success wasn't accidental or temporary, but the result of genuine skill and strategic thinking. More importantly, I'd demonstrated that the transformation I'd undergone since Harold's death was complete and permanent. The uncertain widow who'd needed family guidance no longer existed. In her place was a confident competitor who could hold her own against players half her age and win championships through intelligence and preparation. Marcus met me at the airport, offering to carry my luggage with a deference that would have seemed impossible during our legal battle. The drive home gave us time to talk about the tournament and my victory. Mom, I have to admit, I still don't fully understand what you do at these competitions. But seeing the coverage in the gambling press and talking to other families at Sophia's graduation, I'm beginning to realize we seriously underestimated your abilities. Understanding isn't required, Marcus. Respect is. You have that now, completely. The house felt different when I returned, though nothing had physically changed. It was still the modest ranch where Harold and I had lived for 20 years, still filled with familiar furniture and memories. But it no longer felt like a place where I was waiting for the next phase of life to begin. It had become the headquarters for an active, engaged existence that I'd built entirely on my own terms. I deposited the championship check the next morning, bringing my tournament account balance to over $600,000. Combined with my investment portfolio and other assets, my net worth had grown to nearly $2 million. A figure that would have seemed impossible when I'd made my first tentative visit to the Riverside Community Center. The phone rang as I was reviewing my financial statements. It was Sophia, calling from Northwestern where she was preparing for graduate school applications. Grandma, I saw the tournament results online. You won the whole thing. I did indeed. It was quite an experience. I'm so proud of you, and I have some news of my own. I've been accepted to the graduate program in statistics at Stanford. Sophia, that's wonderful. When do you start? Next fall. But here's the thing, the program is expensive, and even with assistantships and fellowships, I'm looking at significant costs. I understood immediately what she was asking, and I appreciated that she was approaching the subject directly rather than having her parents make the request on her behalf. What are we talking about in terms of expenses? About $40,000 a year for 3 years. I know it's a lot, and I don't want to presume anything, but consider it handled. Education is the best possible investment, and you're exactly the kind of person who'll make excellent use of advanced training in mathematics. Grandma, are you sure? I know you've already helped so much with undergraduate expenses. Sophia, I've won more money playing bingo than most people earn in their entire careers. Supporting your education is both affordable and important to me. We talked for another hour about her graduate program, her research interests, and her career plans. Her enthusiasm for statistical analysis reminded me of my own excitement about probability theory and pattern recognition, the mathematical foundations that had made my tournament success possible. After hanging up, I realized that funding Sophia's graduate education represented more than financial support. It was an investment in intellectual curiosity and academic excellence, values that had guided my own journey from recreational bingo player to championship competitor. The remainder of the summer passed quietly, with regular tournament play and continued success at regional events. I'd established myself as one of the top players in the Midwest circuit, my name regularly appearing in tournament announcements and gambling industry publications. In August, I received an unexpected phone call from a literary agent in New York, who'd read about my legal case and tournament success. Mrs. Chen, I'm wondering if you've considered writing a book about your experiences. Your story combines several elements that publishers find compelling: late-life transformation, family conflict, legal drama, and success in an unconventional field. The idea hadn't occurred to me, but as we discussed the possibilities, I found myself intrigued by the opportunity to share my story with a broader audience. Too many seniors accepted limitations imposed by others' expectations rather than exploring their own potential for growth and achievement. What kind of book are you envisioning? I asked. A memoir that combines personal narrative with practical advice about pursuing new challenges later in life. Your legal victory could help other families navigate similar conflicts, and your tournament success could inspire seniors to consider activities they might have dismissed as inappropriate for their age. I agreed to consider the proposal, recognizing that writing a book would represent yet another unexpected direction in my continuing evolution. The woman who'd once believed her interesting years were behind her was discovering that every achievement opened doors to new possibilities. That evening, I sat in my sunroom with a legal pad, outlining the major themes I might explore in a memoir. The transformation from dependent widow to independent competitor.
The importance of intellectual challenge and continued learning. The family dynamics that can either support or undermine senior autonomy. The discovery of hidden talents and the courage to pursue them seriously. As I wrote, I realized that my story wasn't really about bingo or money or even family conflict. It was about the fundamental human capacity for growth and reinvention, a capacity that doesn't diminish with age but often gets buried under others' assumptions and our own internalized limitations. The phone rang, interrupting my writing. It was Frank Morrison with news about the winter tournament circuit in Florida. "Dorothy, I wanted to give you advance notice about something special. The tournament organizers are planning a special invitational event for players who've won major championships in the past year. First prize is $200,000, with only 16 players invited. That sounds incredible. When and where? December in Miami. The entry fee is substantial, $5,000, but given your recent success, I think you'd be strongly favored to make the final table." As we discussed the tournament details, I found myself already planning strategy for an event 3 months in the future. The competitive drive that had emerged so unexpectedly in my retirement years showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, each victory increased my appetite for greater challenges. After hanging up, I returned to my memoir outline, adding notes about the addictive nature of competition and achievement. Not the pathological addiction my family had worried about, but the healthy addiction to excellence and personal growth that had redefined my understanding of what was possible in the later chapters of life. Tomorrow I would begin preparing for the invitational tournament, researching the other qualified players, and developing strategies for the highest stakes competition I'd ever entered. But tonight, I would continue writing about the journey that had brought me to this point, hoping that my story might encourage other seniors to pursue their own unexpected transformations. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the scratch of my pen on paper. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its evening routines, but inside, I was planning new adventures and reflecting on achievements that had exceeded every expectation I'd held for my retirement years. At 70, I was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.